Justice is served, Worm a one-shot. By TheVampireStrahd. Disclaimer, I do not own Worm or any of the characters, it is owned by the respective creator. Justice is served. A Wormo fanfic. January 3, 2013. Brockton Bay Superior Court Department 34. 1 p.m. The courtroom was packed full with the general public, and more than a few media crews were present in the back getting ready to film what was about to transpire. Everyone was present and waiting for the judge to enter and deliver the absolute final punishment to the convicted individual sitting in the defendant's chair next to her lawyer. She was not talking and she only stared straight ahead. Her lawyer whispered something to her and she just nodded her head in acknowledgement. Finally, there was a noise as the judge's door opened and the judge entered the room. "All rise," cried out the bailiff. Everyone in the courtroom stood up and waited for the judge to say be seated. At which everyone did. The judge shuffled some papers around and looked at the prosecutor. "All right, before I move forward with the sentencing, it is my understanding that there will be a few victim impact statements being made. Is that correct?" The prosecutor, a middle-aged woman, stood up and said, "That is correct, Your Honor." The judge nodded and said, "Very well, you may proceed." The prosecutor said, "The first victim impact statement will be by the victim herself, Taylor Ann Hebert." A young woman sitting in the front row behind the prosecutor squeezed the hand of the young woman she loved and received a pat on the back from her father, who was sitting on her left. She then stood up and made her way to the podium that was in the middle of the courtroom. Taylor was wearing a blue blouse and blue slacks, her long black hair was styled into a long ponytail. She was not wearing glasses anymore due to para-human healing by Panacea by more than a year and a half ago. She was holding papers in her hand and she unfolded it and placed them on the podium. Taylor cleared her throat, then said, "Your Honor, this is not my first victim impact statement. I have given 4 victim impact statements against other defendants in other courtrooms, and I have written 3 victim impact statements that were written and read by prosecutors on M behalf. I stand here 2 years to the day where the incident that the defendant was convicted of her crimes happened. On January 3, 2011, the first day of school after the winter break, I was assaulted and shoved into my locker that was filled with biohazardous waste and insects and left inside for more than 3 hours. This was the culmination of more than a 2-year bullying and harassment campaign waged on a physical and psychological level that was orchestrated by the defendant. She, along with her co-defendants, put my life through hell." Taylor paused to take a drink of water, then continued. "I had known the defendant since we were 5 years old. She became my best friend. We were inseparable. She was the sister I never had. We told each other everything. After my mother's tragic fatal car accident in 2008, she was there for me and helped me through my grief. I thought that we would be friends well into adulthood and beyond. But this did not happen. Shortly before my freshman year in high school, when she betrayed me and began her campaign against me. During that time and after the incident on January 3, 2011, I have never learned why she betrayed me nor why she started her campaign against me. At this point, I do not care to know why. It doesn't matter to me. I have moved on. I have the support of my friends and my father. The only things I want now is for this to finally be over. This is my last victim impact statement. My final remarks are that I want the defendant to be punished and that Emma Barnes, I do not forgive you, but I will forget you." Taylor picked up the paper and water bottle, then turned and went back to her seat without looking at her former best friend. The prosecutor stood up and said, "Next statement will be by the victim's father, Daniel Hebert." Taylor's father, who was sitting on Taylor's left, stood up and made his way to the podium. He didn't have any papers in his hand, he just gripped both sides of the podium and took a couple of moments to regain his composure. Daniel looked serious. He had grown a beard and his hair was neatly combed. He turned to look at Taylor and took in the vision of his daughter sitting with her girlfriend and friends sitting behind her, giving Taylor their support. He smiled at his daughter and she smiled back. Reassured, Daniel A. Bear looked at the judge and spoke. Your Honor, the afternoon and evening of January 3, 2011 was a horror that I would not wish upon anyone. I received a phone call at my place of employment from a police officer informing me that my daughter was being transported to Brockton Bay General. I quickly rushed over there, but I was unable to get any information other than something happened at Winslow High School. My daughter was being treated and I had no knowledge of what was going on until a doctor came and spoke to me 4 hours later. That is when I found out that my daughter had been shoved into her locker that was filled with used tampons, feminine hygiene products, and a horde of insects. This doctor told me that her heart had stopped and they had to revive her more than once. Infections were so prevalent that Panacea had to be called in to deal with it. You have the records. You know Taylor suffered. Daniel paused to regain his composure. I admit, I was not there for Taylor during this time that she was being bullied. I was in my own suffering and I ignored my daughter. I failed Taylor. But, after this incident I would not fail Taylor anymore. I convinced Taylor to talk to me. Really talk. It was the hardest conversation we ever had. When Taylor finally revealed the scope of the bullying to me, when she finally told me that her best friend, a girl that my late wife and I welcomed into our home and lives, was behind it all, it took every ounce of self-control and willpower to not take matters into my own hands. I stand here still in shock that the young woman that has been convicted sitting right there, Daniel pointed at Emma Barnes, the defendant, could actually be so evil and twisted to do such a thing and to do it to someone she called a sister. Emma, I will never forgive you for your betrayal of Taylor. I will never forgive you for what you have done to Taylor. But, I will do my best to forget you. I ask that you do what has to be done, Your Honor, send this young woman to prison for a very long time. She has done the crime now, she must serve the time. Thank you. Daniel turned and went back to his seat next to Taylor. He wrapped his arm around Taylor's shoulder and gave her a one-armed hug. Taylor returned it and gave a reassuring pat on her father's back. There were reassuring whispers told among the group of Taylor's friends and her father. The prosecutor stood up and said, "The next statement is from the defendant's mother, Zoe Barnes." From the middle of the prosecutor's side of the courtroom a blonde woman wearing a blue dress stood up and made her way to the podium. She held a bottle of water and a bundle of Kleenex. She dabbed her eyes with the Kleenex and took a couple of deep breaths. She turned slightly so she could see her daughter sitting at the defendant's table, but the defendant Emma Barnes refused to look at her mother. She continued to stare straight ahead at the wall next to the judge. Emma, never in a million years would I dream that I would be standing here today. I don't know what your father and I have done wrong raising you that you would be here in a courtroom convicted of crimes that I still cannot believe you have committed. You have thrown everything away, and I cannot fathom why. Your father and I tried to help you and you reject the help that was offered to you and you rejected us. Your father is not here. He refused to come here today. I barely made it here. I was in pieces this morning and I am just barely holding on. Your father's heart is broken, your sister's heart is broken, my heart is broken. Your actions have destroyed our family, Emma, and I cannot understand why. I know now that somehow, I failed you. I failed my daughter and I will have to live with this failure for the rest of my life. Goodbye, Emma, I am sorry. Zoe broke down into sobs and turned and went back to her seat. There was no reaction from Emma as she just continued to look at the wall next to the judge. That concludes the victim impact statements, Your Honor, the prosecutor said. The judge turned to look at the defendant's table and said, "Does the defendant have anything to say on her behalf before I pronounce sentence?" Her lawyer stood up and said, "My client has no desire to speak to the court herself, but she has authorized me to say something, Your Honor." "Very well, you may proceed." Emma's lawyer cleared his throat and said, "My client wished me to say that she has done nothing wrong and that is it." There was a murmuring in the courtroom as the audience reacted to that statement. The judge grabbed his gavel and used it and said, "Order, please." The crowd quieted. The judge nodded. Then he looked at the defendant and said, "Very well, so noted. The defendant will rise." Emma's lawyer stood up, then helped Emma stand up, and it appeared that Emma was unsteady on her feet. He grabbed onto Emma's arm to help her remain standing. The judge looked at Emma and said, "In the matter of the people of Massachusetts versus Emma Barnes having been found guilty by a jury of your peers, it falls to me to sentence you for your crimes. On the assault conviction, I sentence you to 3 years. On the harassment, larceny, and possession of stolen property convictions, I sentence you for 5 years on each conviction. For the conspiracy and attempted murder convictions, I sentence you for 10 years on each conviction. On the false imprisonment conviction, I sentence you for 15 years. Furthermore, I order that these sentences are to be served consecutively at a location to be determined by the Massachusetts Department of Corrections. Defendant will be eligible for parole only after completing 90% of her total sentence. This concludes the business before the court. Court is now adjourned." Emma's lawyer shouted, "Your Honor, I object to the sentence being consecutive. I move that the defendant be sentenced to serve her punishment concurrently." The judge used his gavel on the bench. Motion denied. Court is adjourned. Emma had been looking at her lawyer. "Consecutive, what does he mean?" Her lawyer replied, "It means you have to serve the majority of your prison sentence, and you have to serve at least 45 years before you are eligible for parole." Emma paled. 45 years, she shrieked. Deputies had moved to Emma's table and were moving to take her back to the cells below so she could wait for being transported either back to the county jail or to her new state prison when Emma collapsed to the ground in shock at being sentenced to 50 years of prison time. Taylor and her father were thanking the prosecutor for her efforts when they noticed Emma's collapse. Both of them finished talking, then left the courtroom with their friends. Once they were out of the courtroom, they were swarmed by media, but court security was prepared and had a cordon that they could walk through to the elevators and make it outside. Once they walked outside, there was a podium and there was more media gathered around waiting. Taylor, Amy, her father, and her friends waited by the side of the podium. The prosecutor walked out and said, "I have a brief statement, and then Taylor would like to issue a statement as well. Then I will answer some questions." At long last, the Winslow High School bullying and corruption scandal is finally over. Emma Barnes was the final defendant to be sentenced, and that sentencing was done just moments ago. It has been a long and hard journey to see that justice was served, and today that day was today. Now, this city can truly move forward and heal. The prosecutor stepped away and Taylor stepped forward. "I will only say a few words. I will not be taking any questions. However, I will make arrangements later to schedule an interview with one or more media outlets. All I want to say is that I am very happy with the outcome and that I can finally close this unpleasant chapter of my life and begin to move forward. I was 15 when I was shoved into my locker filled with the most horrible things you can possibly imagine. Now I am about to turn 18 and I am getting ready to enter college with my girlfriend Amy. This is what I am focused on. The future. Not the past. I meant what I said about not forgiving Emma Barnes and forgetting her. Thank you." Taylor stepped away and thanked the prosecutor. Then Taylor and everyone else left so that the prosecutor could begin the question and answer session. It was finally over. Author's note: so, after reading a lot of Worm fan fiction, I decided to throw my hat into the ring. I looked around, although not very thoroughly, to see if there was a FIC like this, but I didn't find one. I wrote this pretty fast and on the fly, so I've checked it for spelling as best as I could. This is actually the very first fan fiction that I have ever posted. Anyway, this is a one-shot of an O where the trio were caught, arrested, then tried and convicted. Basically, a student had a brand new smartphone and was filming when Emma and Sophia attacked Taylor and Sophia shoved Taylor into the locker. Footage was uploaded to social media and that was the beginning of the end. Madison ran to the DA's office and spilled what she knew for a sweetheart deal in return for cooperation with the prosecution. She was sentenced to probation until age 18 and 500 hours community service. She publicly apologized to Taylor and Daniel A. Bear at her sentencing. As you can see above, Emma was the focus of this one shot and she was convicted of the charges against her and this was her sentencing. Her father Alan tried to get her to cooperate but Emma refused, and when Emma refused to follow Daddy's orders, Alan washed his hands. He withdrew his support and forced a public defender to defend Emma in an effort to make Emma see reason, but of course Emma didn't see reason and this was the result. Sophia Hess was arrested by the Brockton Bay Police Department, but due to her ward's status she was tried as an adult in a separate court. For violating her probation, her prior deal was voided and the charges were reinstated. She was sentenced to a total of 70 years and not eligible for parole until she had served 65 years. Due to the previous charges being reinstated and being convicted of them is the reason why Sophia is serving more prison time. Sophia's handler was fired from the PRT and convicted of multiple charges of corruption and ended up being sentenced to 30 years to life. Principal Blackwell was fired from the Brockton Bay School District and charged with multiple crimes including embezzlement and ended up receiving a 25-year prison term. Mr. Gladley and other teachers of Winslow High School were also fired and convicted of multiple charges and received 15 to 25-year prison terms. That's about it. I just hope you enjoyed the one shot. I might write an epilogue that I'm kinda tossing in my head. Justice is served, Epilogue, Wormo. By TheVampireStrahd. Disclaimer, I do not own Worm or the characters, those rights belong to the creator. Author's note, I was confident of leaving my one shot as is, but I did mention that I might write an epilogue. Then the idea I had popped in. Then it grew. So, here we are. An epilogue to Justice is Served. Reviews/constructive comments appreciated. Epilogue. January 4, 2048. Massachusetts Correctional Institution, Framingham. Cell Block 5, Wing 4, 2nd floor, cell number 10. 2 p.m. Massachusetts Correctional Institution, Framingham is one of the few state prisons for women. It is overcrowded, just as many of the men's prisons in the state, but given the amount of time that this prisoner is having to serve in custody, she only has to deal with one cellmate who is currently out socializing with the other prisoners. Right now this prisoner is sitting against the wall on her bunk reading a book, A Wrinkle in Time. It is a book she has read before, although the last time she read it, she was a child. The prisoner had been sentenced to 50 years in state prison for multiple crimes committed when she was a teenager. All appeals by her public defender had been exhausted over 20 years ago. She was currently into her 35th year as an inmate. Provided she stayed on her good behavior, she was eligible for parole in 10 years. Maybe sooner, she hoped. Her parents didn't visit, neither did her sister. Her mother had said goodbye at her conviction hearing and her father didn't bother to appear during her trial or her conviction. Her sister visited once during her first year of incarceration, but that encounter did not go well and her sister left crying and vowing never to see her again as well. As the prisoner thought of her sister and her family, she sighed. Years of therapy while incarcerated have finally gotten through to her. She still had group therapy sessions to help her deal with maintaining her issues, but she was in a much better place mentally. She knew what she did was wrong. She blamed her former partner in crime, her best friend, for screwing with her mind and screwing her life over now. It was too little, too late, however. Last she heard through the prison grapevine was that her best friend was now in maximum security for attempted escape, but she didn't care. All this prisoner wanted to do was finish serving her time. Shortly after her incarceration, another inmate, an old woman that was serving life without parole, took her under her wing once she got her head out of her ass and helped her with acclimating to prison life. The two ended up becoming good friends, and when her friend died of natural causes in her sleep, she mourned the loss of her mentor. Prison life was slow life. She realized her knowledge of the law from her father being a lawyer could help others, so this led to a GED, then law school. She now helped other inmates with their cases from time to time. But she was picky. she could afford to be since she was serving such a long prison sentence and she only helped those prisoners where they were innocent and/or mitigating circumstances that she believed the prisoner really had a chance at a new life once released. There was always noise during the day at the prison. Inmates talking and yelling to each other in the cell blocks, guards yelling, buzzers and bells sounding as cell doors and gates were opened and closed. It was your typical state prison. The prisoner heard the mail cart being pushed down the corridor and upon looking at the clock she knew for sure that it was the mail cart making its way. As usual, the prisoner was not expecting any mail but her cellmate occasionally received a letter from family. However, the prisoner was surprised when the cart stops and the guard says, "Barnes. Mail call." The guard is holding an envelope through the bars of her cell. The prisoner known as inmate number 1,04,785,879 Emma Barnes jumped down from her bunk and grabbed the envelope. As Emma looked at the envelope she noticed that it was opened. The guard said, "You know the drill, had to check it first." "I had to check the records. I do believe this is your first letter in 30 years. The guard resumed his task of pushing the mail cart down the corridor and delivering mail to the inmates. Emma climbed back up to her bunk and looked at the envelope. The envelope had a return address but it was not an address she recognized and it was from Boston. It was addressed to her but she didn't know who sent this to her yet. Taking a deep breath, Emma looked inside the envelope to find a greeting card. The back of the card was blank so she flipped it over so she could see the front and it was a picture of her old house in Brockton Bay. It took her a moment or two then she opened the card to find a picture slide out. Looking at the picture, it was picture of herself from when she was celebrating her birthday when she turned 8 years old. She stared at that picture of her younger self. Those green eyes so bright and innocent. The smile so wide and full teeth. The green sundress she was wearing with cute little black shoes. A tear began to fall as she realized and remembered the photographer of this picture. "Taylor," Emma whispered. Looking at the card, on the right side there was a handwritten note. "In the memory of the young girl in the enclosed picture I once knew and called sister, I forgive you. Taylor." Emma stared at the message and it took her a long time before she realized that a great weight had been lifted. She realized that tears were falling steadily but she quickly made sure that the card did not get wet. Taking a deep breath Emma whispered, "Thank you Taylor. I'm sorry." The end. Thank for watching.